Welcome to Belmont Poetry Night. I'm Monica Korde, your host and the Poet Laureate of Belmont, California. We meet on the third Tuesdays of every month to celebrate the spoken word as makers, listeners, and admirers of poetry. We come with featured guests and an open mic, always. After gathering for several years at our favorite physical venue, the Belmont Library, since the pandemic, our thriving poetry circle has transitioned to this virtual space, and I'm grateful this allows me to welcome poets and listeners from across the globe. I hope all of you are doing well, and it's always wonderful to see poetry enthusiasts gathered in one room, even if it is virtual. Everyone makes for such an inspiring sight, and I'm so happy to see you all there. And most of you all know our poetry night tradition of shouting out names of cities and states or countries we come from. And I invite you to share in the chat where you are joining me from tonight. So please continue sharing, and thank you so much for being here and zooming in. I know many of you look forward to these summer gatherings we have when that sunshine state of mind invites us to slow down, savor poetry, and share in the warmth of words and community. Speaking of which, seasons have always inspired poets, each with its own rhythms, colors, and moods. And this summer, I was moved to turn our attention to the art of translation, echoing the spirit of summer travels, and hence our theme, Summer Transversals, Art of Translation. More than a theme, I believe this poetry night is a celebration of how poetry journeys across languages, across cultures, and lived experiences. And if we look at the art of translation, I believe it is a kind of crossing, a transversal path where meaning, rhythm, and voice travel beyond borders. So, to put it more poetically, I feel it is where the heart of a poem beats in multiple tongues, inviting new perspectives, new emotions, and new connections. So, we'll spend tonight with poems and dialogue that lead us into these poetic crossings and the deeper layers of translation. And much like the journeys summer invites us to take, I invite you to be part of this shared exploration to experience how poetry moves between and beyond the worlds. To start off, I was exploring work by contemporary poet translators and came across a poem in French. I'm not sure if we have any French speakers with us tonight, but I chose it because I feel that the language carries a lyrical depth, and in translation, it opens up beautifully, revealing new layers of meaning. Written by French poet Claire Malraux and translated by American poet Marilyn Hacker. This untitled poem is a luminous meditation on the quiet, eternal transition from night into day. And you will see that Marilyn Hacker's translation preserves not just the clarity and grace of Malraux's voice, but also the lyric intensity and philosophical stillness that define the poem's power. I'll start by reading Madeline Hacker's English translation first, and then share Claire Malraux's original in French. And I hope you will enjoy experiencing the poem in both voices. When night has died, the stars' memory keeps burning. A dazzling ink remains in the handwriting of dawn. The world bursts forth, tearing nothing apart. Like gives birth to like. joyful renewal. Bellies are haloed, heavy with unborn sons. Bird arrows dart up toward fertile forms. Virgins are blossoming on the bed of time. Angel bushes spring from their navels. Everything is possible. And now the original in French. I'm not a native speaker, but I'll do my best to honor the sound and rhythm of the language as I read. Morte la nuit, la mémoire des étoiles brûle. Une encre éblouissante subsiste dans l'écriture de l'aube. Le monde naît sans déchirement. Le même enfante le même, allègre renouvellement. Des ventres se nimbrent, lourdes de fœtus de soleil. Des flèches d'oiseaux s'élancent vers les formes fertiles. Sur le lit du temps, les vierges bourgeonnent. Des buissons d'anges jaillissent de leur nombril. Tout est possible. Thank you. Well, a little about these fine makers of poetry. Claire Malroux is a celebrated French poet, and she's also known for her powerful translations of Emily Dickinson into French and many other renowned poets as well. Her own poetry has been brought into English with great care by American poet and renowned translator Marilyn Hacker, who describes translation as a chance to work in the clay of poetic language, allowing her the opportunity to engage directly with poetic strategies different from her own. And translation in this way, I think, becomes both a creative practice and a dialogue, one that bridges languages, cultures, and poetic sensibilities. And this kind of deep cross-cultural engagement is also central to the work of our guest poet this evening, Terry Ehret. Translation holds a meaningful place in her repertoire, and I'm honored to feature her tonight and delve briefly into her creative world through our conversation. So let me take a moment to introduce her more fully. Terry Ehret, one of the founders of 16 Rivers Press, earned a degree in psychology from Stanford University and an MA in creative writing from San Francisco State. She has published 4 collections of poetry, most recently Night Sky Journey from Kelly's Cove Press. Her literary awards include the National Poetry Series, the California Book Award, the Pablo Neruda Poetry Prize, a translation fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, a Northern California Book Award for California Poetry in Translation, and 8 Pushcart Prize nominations. With translation partners John Johnson and Nancy J. Morales, she has published 3 volumes of the poetry of Mexican author Ulalume González de Leon. We'll be treated to that tonight. From 2004 to 2006, she served as the Poet Laureate of Sonoma County, where she lives and teaches writing. What extraordinary accolades, Terry. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Monica. I'm so delighted to be part of your reading series. Belmont is my hometown. And we didn't have bookstores. This was in the late 50s, early 60s. And Not much of a writing or literary community, but we had a library.
Mhm.
So that was my passport to other worlds. And I'm so delighted to be part of a series that is connected with the Belmont Public Library.
Absolutely, Terry. I hear you. I love that you call them passports, and that's what I feel libraries are like portals and passports, just getting us through places. And it's so beautiful and wonderful that we still have our public libraries with us. And Belmont is a beloved library, personally for me as well.
Right. Well, I would like to let your participants this evening know something about Ulalume Gonzalez de Leon. Um, she was born in Montevideo, Uruguay. She became a nationalized Mexican citizen and identified as Mexican, in part because the literary publishing world in Uruguay didn't recognize women authors. So for her to, she really found a much richer community of women writers and published writers in Mexico City. So that was part of her reason for becoming a Mexican citizen. Both her parents were poets, and that perhaps explains how she came by that unusual name, Ulalume. It's from a Edgar Allan Poe poem. Um, she studied philosophy and literature at the Sorbonne in Paris and finished her studies at the University of Mexico. She married the architect Teodoro Gonzalez de Leon, and they had 3 children. In the 1970s, which was when she began publishing, she was part of a generation of Latin American women writers who were challenging the traditional identities of women, marriage, and relationships. And for Ulalume, often that took the form of experimentation with language and syntax. And I'll talk a little more about that later. She worked with Nobel Prize laureate Octavio Paz on the journals Plural and Vuelta. John Johnson and I have been translating Ulalume's poetry for 13 years. And during that time, we have come to know her unusual diction, her syntax, her punctuation or absence thereof, her playfulness, her sensuality, her philosophical and scientific abstractions, and of course, her plagios, which in Spanish means plagiarisms. Ulalume believed, quote, everything has already been said. And thus each act of creation is a reworking, reshuffling, reconstructing of one great work. She borrowed freely from a wide range of sources, and for this reason, she chose the title Plagios for her collected poems. I was originally drawn to Ululume's quirky blend of scientific diction and erotic, sensual imagery when I read a series of prose poems called Anatomy of Love back in 1982. And then later, in learning more about her and her poetry and beginning to translate her work, became clear to me there were certain themes in her poetry that matched concerns and obsessions and themes in my own work. 2 of these are the nature of language, its paradoxes, its mysteries, the way it can reflect and alter our perceptions, and the nature of intimacy with its power to define and sometimes confine or dissolve the boundaries of our identity. I've chosen 4 short poems from Plagios Volumes 1 and 2 that explore these two themes. And I'll read each poem first in English, and then John will follow in Spanish. Sometimes if you have a little Spanish, it helps to have heard the English first so that you can more easily follow it when you hear it in the original language. So many of Ululume's poems, not just the one I'm about to read, explore the idea that whether we're talking about written or spoken language, no matter what language we're using, that essentially we're translating from some pre-verbal or nonverbal original language closer to music and dreams. Her poetry tries to reach that ineffable level of experience, and or at least point to it. And ultimately, its home is in silence.
Yeah, and Terry, I can't wait for you to lead us into your world. But before we dive in, may I take a quick moment to just let our audience know John is with us? Thank you. So tonight we are also honored to have with us another remarkable poet, John Johnson, whom you've been hearing about, who in collaboration with Terry has co-translated the poetry of Ulalume. And Terry will be sharing, as she said, some of those translated poems, and John has graciously joined us to bring them to life in their native language, in Spanish. I would say, adding a powerful dimension to our understanding and appreciation of how both voices work together. So, thank you so much, John, for joining us. I'm really grateful to Terry for drawing you into this shared space of poetry. And over to you, Terry.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for being part of this tonight. So the poem I'm going to read is from volume 1. It's a 4-line poem. It's called Word. Spoken word, so alone, so naked. Go back to wearing the unsayable.
Palabra, pronunciada palabra, tan sola, tan desnuda. Regrésate a vestirte de indecible.
And the second poem, also from volume 1, is called L'Esprit de la Langue, or Spirit of the Language. And you'll note that the title is in French, not in Spanish. Ulalume sometimes used words and phrases from other languages in her poems. And she herself was a translator. In fact, she co-translated her own poems into French for the chapbook Ciel Entier. And in this poem, she's looking at another kind of estrangement that language creates. Spirit of the language. You could not speak bird. You could not speak wind. You could not speak sea. You would miss, I think, the spirit of the language. What they have said, the wave, the air, the blackbird, admits no discussion. You, on the other hand, twist, ring the words.
L'esprit de la langue. No podrías hablar en pájaro. No podrías hablar en viento. No podrías hablar en mar. Te faltaría, creo, l'esprit de la langue. Lo que han dicho la ola, el aire, el mirro, no admite discusión. Tú En cambio, tuerces, retuerces las palabras.
The next poem reflects my own fascination with a branch of philosophy called language theory, particularly the theories of Jacques Lacan and also the women poets and writers who in the 1960s and 70s were adapting Lacan's ideas to feminist theory and psychology. So these writers were proposing that the very structure of our subject-verb-object language shapes our objectification of the other, something that's totally anathema to intimacy, compassion, or empathy. But if you change the language in some radical way, you can break free of what they considered a colonization of the other in our relationships. This poem that I'm going to read is called Piel, or Skin. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, but I wanted to show how it looks on the page because her use of pronouns, one on top of the other, suggests a kind of simultaneity and non-hierarchy, this kind of intimate equation of self and other. Skin. At the intersection of your, my voice that floods me, you, and your, my voice that envelops me, you, this skin forms. Skin that doesn't divide, that has neither one side nor another. Skin of happy osmosis, without borders.
If I can just take a quick pause, Terry, and I really liked that you shared just a page of the poem, but I have the poem with me, so if it is all right, I can share my screen. So while John reads the original in Spanish, our viewers will be able to see the poem as well.
Neat.
Yeah, I'll just take a moment. And there it should be coming up right now. Do you all see it? Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Terry, would you like to recite that one again, one more time before John takes it up?
Sure.
Thank you.
Skin. At the intersection of your, my voice that floods me, you, and your, my voice that envelops me, you, this skin forms. Skin that doesn't divide, that has neither one side nor another. Skin of happy osmosis, without borders.
Piel. En la intersección de tu, mi, voz, que me te inunda, y tu, mi, voz, que me te envuelve, se forma esta piel. La piel que no separa, que no tiene lado y aquel lado, la de ósmosis felices, sin aduanas.
Thank you both for sharing those pieces. If we may take a pause for a question, I guess, before we move on with other pieces. Terry, would that be a good idea?
Absolutely.
Perfect. I really loved the opening pieces, and I'm sure our audience was really engaged in listening to both the voices. It's really amazing to see how poetry can shift and breathe in both these languages, and both of you did such a beautiful recitation of those. So thank you once again. I was listening to some of those poems you offered, and inviting us to appreciate how translation is not just about words, but about capturing the spirit and depth of the original. And it makes me think of something that Edith Grossman, a well known translator of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, once said that translation is not made from tracing paper, it is an act of critical interpretation. And building on Grossman's view of translation as a creative interpretation, another poet, Patricia Crane, who translated works of Swedish poet Thomas Tranströmer, offers an interesting angle. And she shared in one of her interviews that she's often asked how translation influences her own creative writing, but rarely the reverse. And so, to offer our audience insight into your artistic process, Terry, I'd like to begin with a question in that spirit. As a poet who's attuned to the nuances of language, actively interpreting and shaping it, how does your own creative process shape the way you approach translation? And in what ways do the demands and discoveries of your poetry inform your translation choices? Conversely, how does the act of translating feed back into your original work? So, a lot of questions tied in there, but
Yeah, they're interesting questions. It really got me to think, because my own process as a writer is to begin with whatever is at hand. I write very improvisationally, and I kind of let my associative logic engine take the lead, so that I'm engaged in something that the poet Robert Bly called leaping poetry, or what Stephen King calls dreaming awake. Um, Now, this is true of the drafting stage, but it's a whole other process when I move into the revision and editing stage. But I rarely start with an idea, and I certainly don't know where the poem is going till I discover it. Translating, quite different. You begin with a finished poem. Your goal is to render it into first into some literal English version, try to interpret its meaning so that you know how far you can stray from the literal, how much room you can leave for music and emotions that are always so much harder to express in English than in Spanish. But I will say that what Lorca calls the duende in my own poetry, that mischievous energy and spirit, gives me some idea how we might go about honoring this element in Ulalume's work. Rosalia Castellanos said that that was, for her, the distinguishing characteristic of Ulalume's poetry, her duende.
yeah, beautiful. Thanks for sharing those insights, Terry. I know you have a few more poems in translation for us,
Yeah,
so let's hear those as well. Thank you.
yeah. The poem I just read, Skin, and the one I'm about to read called Syntax, they are from a section of volume 2 called Los Juntos, which we had a really hard time deciding how to translate. It means the joined, it means the couple, it means those who are close together. But Ulalume was deliberately not using the Spanish word for couple or the Spanish word for married couple or any of the more traditional views. She was using the poems as a experiment in how else to define intimacy. And there's something novel and transgressive about what she's up to there. So this poem, she's playing around with some of the terminology of language theory, phrase and discourse, thought and silence, but in the context of intimacy. Syntax. Not touching you is a silence in the discourse of touching you, but is a word in the phrase of looking at you. Not looking at you is a silence in the discourse of looking at you, but is a word in the phrase of thinking of you. Not thinking of you is unthinkable, like a phrase of silences interrupted by silences.
Sintaxis. No tocarte es un silencio en el discurso de tocarte, pero es una palabra de la frase de estar mirándote. No mirarte es un silencio en el discurso de mirarte, pero es una palabra de la frase de estar pensándote. No pensarte es impensable, como una frase de silencios, interrumpidos por silencios.
And I have one more of Ulalume's poems to share with you. It's another short one, just 4 lines long. It's from volume 3. And volume 3 is interesting because it combines some of her most playful, most nonsense poems, some intended for children, filled with just plays on words, alongside some of her most deeply and profoundly philosophical poems about the nature of our existence. So this is from the nonsense verse section of volume 3. And I picked this poem. It's called The Lover, El Amante, because it illustrates a couple of things that Monica, you had expressed some interest in. How do you balance in a collaborative translation process the individual voices, the individual interpretations, with the demands of the poem itself and what the poem needs to say. And I will say that working with the team definitely calls for some bargaining and compromise, no doubt about it. But even if it's just one translator translating a piece, there are still compromises and bargains because you have to think, what do I prioritize? The meaning, the music, the tone, the diction? Should I use Latinate cognates in my translations? Or do I want to go for the physicality of an Anglo-Saxon word choice, as John and I and Nancy did in our translation of word, of parabla. In El Amante, the lover we get a really good illustration of both kinds of compromises, and also an illustration of how Ululume borrows rather freely from other texts. In this case, a poem by American educator and poet Hughes Mearns, best known for his nonsense verse, which are ostensibly for children, but often with a wink at politics and social commentary. Ululume says that she has written her poem in the style of Hughes Mearns. She didn't name a particular poem, but thanks to John, who did a little research, he came up with one that she may have had in mind. It's called The Perfect Reactionary. And this is Hughes Mearns. As I was sitting in my chair, I knew the bottom wasn't there, nor legs, nor back, but I just sat, ignoring little things like that. So, as you all already know, a reactionary is someone who strongly opposes social or political or economic change, often in the complete absence of any utility of the status quo. We're experiencing a lot of that kind of reactionary thinking and behavior right now. But I think you can see how Mearns was using the nonsense verse to comment on the irrational conservatism of his day. Now, Ululume's poem has a lot in common with Hughes Mearns. She doesn't identify that specific poem as the source, but sometimes she didn't bother to be specific about her sources. And in this case, I wanted to start with the poem in Spanish. You can hear how similar it is in rhyme and meter to the kind of playful sing-song of Hughes Mearns. John, would you mind reading?
Yeah.
The poem is called The Lover in English, El Amante in Spanish.
El amante. Mientras besaba a Rosalía, notó que de ella nada había, ni tronco, ni cabeza, ni miembros, pero esos detalles olvidó y la cubrió de besos.
A simple little poem, but we had a heck of a time figuring out what to prioritize for many reasons. John and I both tried our hands at rendering Ululume's poem in English, recreating her and Mearns's, sing-song, meter, and rhyme. John, do you want to share your version?
Sure. In this version, I try to preserve the rhyme and the rhyme scheme, but at some expense to the poor poem. The lover. While kissing the face and limbs of his love, he noticed she had none of the above. But such details are not, and best forgot.
Now, I tried also. I was working a little more with the meter, but also trying to achieve the rhyme. While Rosalia he was kissing, he noticed she was missing her torso, head, and limbs, but these details mattered not, and in kisses were forgot. Now, both those versions prioritize the rhyme and meter, but they're both a little stilted. The diction is a little archaic and the word order not conversational. So, that's a challenge when you're trying to use rhyme and meter in English. It's not a rhyme-rich language. It's not as musical a language as Spanish. So we kept working with our translation partner, Nancy, to devise a version that is, I think, closer to the literal and more natural in some ways, more conversational. And this is the version that finally appears in volume 3. And I just want to say I'll leave it to you to decide if you think Ulalume's poem might, like Mearns's poem, have a subversive subtext about this lover's complete obliviousness to the absence of his beloved. The lover. While kissing Rosalia, he noticed there was nothing to her, no torso, head, or limbs, but these details he overlooked and covered her with kisses. Do you have any other questions, Monica, or maybe?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's perfect time, Terry, and especially with the El Amante poem that you shared, and it has these alternate versions of translations, which really is so striking the way language has been used. And I'm really fascinated by how the musicality of language is felt in these translations, which reminds me of how other poet translators work towards that. And I remember last time we spoke about Brenda Hillman, who also works on translations. And Brenda Hillman has spoken about being guided by poetic judgment rather than full fluency in translation, striving to preserve a poem's aesthetic, even with secondhand understanding of the language. And Robert has who also is such a prolific poet and translator, famously called translation a warrior's art, which I see that there is a lot to worry about and so many negotiations that you have to make, which really, I mean, what he says captures the deep care and inner attention that the process demands. So turning to both of you, John and Terry, I came across some of your past interviews with each of you, and wherein John, you mentioned that during the translation of a particular poem, when there are multitude of meanings of a certain word, at one point you set aside trying to capture every meaning in the translation, hoping that the following line, in your words, would generate enough heat. And I found that so interesting. That perspective is really fascinating. And Terry, I was really struck by your insight where you have mentioned, and I'll quote you here, the emotional content of a poem is often embedded in the internal sounds, rhythms, and music of a line, aspects that often lie just below the level of our conscious awareness. That's so thought-provoking, and I'd love to hear from both of you on this. In translation, where those subtleties often shift, how do you balance the original poet's voice with your own poetic intuition, or the voice of the translator, if I may call it? And having co-translated Ulalume's poetry, uh, as you referred to the collaborative process, what does that collaborative process reveal about the relationship between fluency and poetic judgment in translation? Whoever would like to take it up first. John, would you like to get into it?
Yeah, you know, I it was such a long process, and you know, getting into Ulalume's, just in particular in Ulalume's voice. You know, I think I'm still trying to understand exactly what her voice is. And like Terry was mentioning, she's relied on so many sources from she was a prolific translator herself. And so she's taking basing poems basing poems in Spanish on poems in English or in Italian or French. So that idea of finding a voice is, I think it's a really, it happens over time, but um, relying on what the poet herself says about her poetry was really helpful. I mean, she begins her book with telling us that these are games. So that sort of tells us something about, what her voice is going to be. She also groups her poems under headings like games, for example, or for commentary, which kind of makes you think maybe this is going to be a little more philosophical, a little more thoughtful. And then she's got sections that are just nonsense verse. So that was really helpful. Also, she's got a bunch of notes in her book, where she tells you where the inspiration came from. So that's a good source of trying to get a sense of what her voice is. And then, of course, what other people say about her, like Octavio Paz, his introduction that we have in the first volume. That was really helpful in, trying to get a sense of who she is and where she's coming from.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I mean, it's so much more challenging with a poet from the past that you're trying to translate. Because when I was reading about how Madeline Hacker works on her French translations, but Claire Malroux is a living poet and she works in collaboration with the with the poet. So that's what she had mentioned in one of her interviews, is that. Malraux has a lot of classical knowledge and classical literature understanding, which in all of it in French, which Hacker doesn't have. But because she works in collaboration with the poet, it becomes easier for her to understand and bring that into her translation in English poems. So I can see that the work is so much harder for you when you are trying to look for other sources that give you a hint or clue into getting into that poet's voice.
Oh, there were many times when Nancy and Terry and I were sitting together in a cafe or in someone's home saying, "Are we channeling Ulalume? Is Ulalume at the table?"
Yeah.
Trying to get in touch with her.
Almost like a poetic seance.
Yeah.
We did not, unfortunately, have the opportunity to work with her. She passed away in 2009, but
Mm,
we did get to meet her son and daughter,
mm,
and their children, and they really gave us permission to explore Ulalume's eroticism in a way you wouldn't expect a poet's children to be
mm,
enthusiastic about that. Because though she writes in a kind of, I don't know, academic isn't quite the right word, but an elevated voice,
mm.
often. But in the next line, she can have some kind of quirky euphemism for, a sexual part of the anatomy, all in the same poem. So she's got these many voices that she uses. And I will say that when Bill O'Daly, who's translated so many of Neruda's books
Mm,
for Copper Canyon Press, when he read our first volume, he commented that somehow Nancy, John, and I had taken 4 poetic voices, counting Ulalume's, and created a single coherent translation voice. And part of that, I think, does come from working as a team. We kind of have to leave our own poetic voices at the door.
mhm,
Working as a team has its drawbacks, certainly, but there are many times when one or the other, all three of us might feel disappointed in a translation because we weren't getting a line translated the way we had hoped to. But it also can rub the edges of the ego a little so that we can achieve that coherent voice where we're not clinging so much to our own. And I think we tried to maintain that through all three volumes. And regarding fluency, there's lots of ways to be fluent. I am not fluent. I'm literate in Spanish, but not fluent. John has a conversational fluency. And I would say more than that as well. And Nancy is bilingual, so she has the fluency of a native speaker. But what I could bring to this was I had a fluency in poetry. And so in making this an English poem, John has that ability too. And interesting that over the 13 years we worked on this translation, Nancy also came to be a writer of poetry.
Beautiful. That's amazing. It's so inspiring to learn all of this. And thank you so much, both of you, Terry and John, for sharing that. And what you've both brought into discussion here, it reminds us that translation is as much about connecting with the poem's soul as it is about mastering the words. And I'm really grateful for the work that you have done, which gives us a chance to explore another poet's voice and just get an understanding of how they have worked or what they have expressed. So it's absolutely wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of it and the translated works as well, Terry and John.
Well, thank you, Monica. It's been a pleasure.
And yeah, and before we move on, I would love for our audience to get a taste of your own work and your own poetry as well, Terry. So we are well into our poetic journey. If you think it is the right time to turn to some of your own poetry, we can do that now.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I have picked a poem was related to one of your questions, Monica, about landscape.
Oh, yeah.
Landscape and emotional landscape. And, as I said before, I'm a very improvisational poet and I'll work with whatever's at hand. And before I began translating formally, I engaged in a poetic practice called homophonic translation. I refer to it as mistranslation, where I'm just working with the sounds of the words in a language I may or may not know, and bringing the sounds over into English. And back in 2007, I was in Southern Colorado during the monsoon season. And I was in this very dramatic landscape of the San Juan Mountains. I was also reading Pablo Neruda's 20 Love Poems and a Song of Despair in Spanish. And I was working with the form and the imagery and the music of his sonnets in composing my own. The last section of the book, Night Sky Journey, is a sequence of 8 sonnets, all set in this primeval landscape. And for any of you who have ever been to the Southwest during monsoon season, you know something, well, Texas was certainly experiencing that tragically. This is called Summer Storm Approaching, San Juan Mountains. Pale, white, and yellow, these ghost stones, eroded into crosses and spires, naked peaks wisps of gray, songs of half-light birds, and a single note abandoned like the foam of a wave. Here, the mountain is the only greeting, carrying on its shoulder a young moon, the day's long heat, the smallest of lakes. Old riches lie sleeping in the vast heights, and islands of white mist fill the valleys far up in the ragged edges of the earth and sky. In the humid twilight, I feel the air tensing, humming with the first charge of storm, as if a dream might split me open, the way the red and pregnant air waits to be broken open. Dry sea, lifted high into the midst of the last blue air. This body alongside my body, so ancient, so strong, like a piece of eternity. It pins my soul at once and ever. A flash of stormlights and thunder rolling down the underside of heaven.
That was beautiful, so rich and evocative. Such a beautiful piece with such vivid imagery as well. And I love the quiet strength that your writing itself holds, Terry.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for sharing that piece. I'd like to just, since we have shifted focus to your own poetry, I'm really wondering to know, and since you mentioned about the emotional landscape, that's what my question was. How do you see the natural world shaping or mirroring the emotional landscapes in your poems?
Yeah, well, the landscapes in my poem, not a nature writer.
Mm,
That's always been challenging for me, and I so admire those who are good at attending to the natural world and don't try to impose anything of themselves
mm,
on it, like the finest of the haiku poets. Um, so the landscapes in my poems evoke and mirror this inner emotional terrain, which in itself is linked to memory, which I consider the great unreliable narrator of our lives. So we come up against these other stories of ourselves that the landscape can prompt. But that said, William Carlos Williams said perception is the first act of imagination, and I am an
mm,
improvisational poet, so um, I have to be paying attention to whatever is at hand. And take my inspiration from that. I love random prompts. I
mhm.
love uh, leaving myself open to interruption and redirection. And for that reason, um, travel is especially if I'm in some place that's geographically or geologically or linguistically or culturally different from my familiar world, it provokes this different movement of the imagination. Um, so, yes, there is this relationship between external and internal, um, because what I'm trying to do is find a different way of perceiving, and
Mm,
and that's what the landscape that is not familiar to me, that's dangerous, or someplace I might get lost,
mm.
that's actually really exciting to me as a writer.
Yeah, it's truly captivating, and we can feel that in your poetry. And also, hearing your voice in your own work, Terry, gives us a deeper sense of your artistic vision, which I think brings me to my final question, and also a full circle to our conversation tonight. Uh, my question seeks to know your thoughts both as a poet and a translator. And I know that during your years as Sonoma County's Poet Laureate, you worked to build a truly meaningful literary bridge between the Spanish speaking and the English speaking communities through several projects, which I feel is such an important and inspiring effort to foster connection and understanding and have this shared creativity across cultures. So, in that spirit of connection and cultural exchange, for those interested in beginning translation work, what do you think are the most important things to keep in mind, and how can emerging translators develop sensitivity to both the source language and their own poetic instincts?
Yeah. Um, if you're interested in translating, jump in. Um, I think that this time in our cultural and political lives, we need to be really careful not to give in to the monoculture and monolanguage ideology, that to push against it. And one way to do that is to translate. Um, I really want to honor that long and illustrious history, but invite people to be a part of it. Find a poet or writer that really grabs you. Fluency isn't as important as passion, but you should feel some intuitive resonance with the writer's work because you're going to be spending a lot of time with it. So you want it to be something that nourishes and enriches your own writing as well. If you're not bilingual, I'm not bilingual, then you need a native speaker to work with, maybe several. But if you're a poet translating poetry, don't underestimate your fluency as a poet. You're going to be able to bring a translation into your language with some grace and skill. And without that, you risk losing your reader. There are a lot of poets who have translated the works of writers in an original language they didn't know or didn't know well or didn't have fluency in. Ezra Pound was translating Chinese, barely knew it himself. Coleman Barks from Persian, Stephen Mitchell from German, Brenda Hillman from the Portuguese, and Robert Bly from any number of languages. Because they were willing to risk it, because they were willing to really wrestle with the dictionary and grammar book and different translations to inform their own, we now have these poets in English that we wouldn't have otherwise had. Rumi and Transtromer, Rilke, so many others. And, you make friends with the native speakers, and that enlarges your scope in your life so much.
Absolutely. That's such a great takeaway and such great advice, Terry. So insightful as well. Thank you so much for this and really for sharing both your translations and your own powerful poems with us tonight. And I'd like to thank John once again. Thank you, John, for weaving the original language into the fabric of this experience and joining in our conversation as well. It's been a real gift to hear both voices in dialogue. And I'm sure our audience is intrigued and really engaged in this interesting angle or component of the poetry world, as one of our poets here listening in has said in the chat. So before we close and move on to the open mic portion of the evening, I'd like to give the audience a quick minute to share a word with you. And everyone, please take a brief moment to share your thoughts with Terry. And we have the open mic to go to, so to respect everyone's time, it's a request to save your questions for the chat, where I'll also be posting links to Terry's poetry and an introduction to John Johnson, who joined us as well. So please watch the chat space, but feel free to unmute yourself and speak to Terry.
Well, thank you. And I especially liked piel in Spanish, and I really enjoyed the music of the Spanish poem. So thank you.
I was curious if the three of you collaborators have ever published 3 translations of the same poem together, because I loved hearing your different versions.
Well, we have been tempted. I think that's a really interesting proposition. There are different ways to go about, collaboration, and I've seen translation teams where one translator takes a certain group of poems and translates them, and another translator takes another group of poems, and that can work beautifully too. I'm not sure we ever, formally decided that we would only have one version of each, but our way of resolving it when we had more than one version was we sometimes put the alternate versions in the translator's notes. God bless translator's notes. They can solve a lot of arguments by just saying this one's going to go in the notes at the back, or that we would present the other versions at readings and presentations like this.
Yeah, Ellen, your question is great. It brings up this whole idea of a translation. It is never the original. It is always somebody's, some translators take on it, and that translator will have one perspective, and another will have another and another. So you're never really reading that original poet. It's always, it's always somebody else's poem that you're reading.
I wanted to thank you very much for this entire discourse here about translation. I really can resonate with things you said, and now have more questions myself than I ever had before. I'm doing some translations of my own. I don't write in my native language at all. I write in English. I find that my native language has moved away from me. I haven't been living there for 60 years. The language changes. So I decided that I should do my work only in English. But then, of course, for the sake of some friends, I tried to translate my own work. And I was particularly grateful that you mentioned boldly that English simply does not have a repertoire of expressions for feelings. I have always felt very clumsy, very self-conscious when I bring that up. I can see the questions in people's eyes. How dare you say that? We are the language, this is the language of Shakespeare. They don't get it. I'm still saying, and I was very happy to hear you say it. So I found very often that when I want to translate my own work into another language, I'm terribly tempted, and sometimes I succumb in writing the poem from anew in that language. It is easier. And then, of course, it's like, you, John, said, the original is not there. It just isn't. It is never, the translation is never, ever an original poem the way it was. But I wanted to ask you something else. When you are translating with 2 or 3 other people. What is the balance that is being played out? I find that when I do myself a translation, and then on those occasions when somebody translated my stuff into Italian and we were collaborating,
Mhm.
the compromise was the biggest word those days. Those were days of compromise. Do you ever find that you are a harsher critic when you don't have anyone else involved in translation than when you have 2 or 3 of you? Have you ever felt that way?
A harsher critic of
Critic of your work, of the translation itself? Or do you find it easier that you can avail yourself of more than one person's insight into the poem that you are translating?
I really liked having translation partners most of the time. I would say almost all the time. But we could get really attached to our own version of a translation, and John and I would usually come with a draft. Maybe it would be more literal, and Nancy, being a native speaker, she could often just jump in and translate on the spot. But I think we could get critical of ourselves and of each other quite easily. Thank goodness that a lot of our meetings were held at a winery in Sonoma County that Nancy's husband owned, and every now and then he'd come in with, pour us a few glasses of wine, and that would take the edge off a little bit. I just want to say, Myrna, that when you said my native language has left me, has moved away from me, I think is what you said. I love that line, and I hope you write a poem to go with it.
All right, thank you. Probably I will when I run out of themes.
I feel that way all the time. But I don't have a particularly good reason to be feeling that way, but I feel like my native language is sometimes nowhere to be found.
Yes. Thank you all together. This was wonderful.
Well, thanks everyone. As much as I would like these conversations to keep going, I can see and sense that our audience has really engaged in this discussion and really found so many enlightening pieces from it. I'd like to thank you once again, Terry, for being with us, and it was a real pleasure to host you. And I hope you enjoyed this reading experience as much as all of us did.
Great pleasure. Thank you, Monica.
Well, I shall invite you again at the end of our open mic segment, if you're with us till the end, Terry, to offer us a closing poem.
Yeah.
And by the looks of it, it seems we'll definitely go on a little longer than usual. But for now, please sit back and enjoy the rest of our evening. With that, we are going to stop recording this segment. Those of you who are in the Zoom room, please stay online for the open mic segment of the evening. To the YouTube audience, thanks for joining in and hope to see you for next month's Belmont Poetry Night. Good night.